Excited to introduce today's visiting author, Larry Bergreen. Mr. Bergreen is an award-winning biographer who currently serves as a featured historian for the History Channel and frequently lectures at major universities and symposiums. His previous work includes profiles of Magellan, Louis Armstrong, Al Capone, Irving Berlin, and James Agee. He's here today to talk to us about his latest endeavor, a biography of Marco Polo.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here today. Marco Polo is a legendary figure to most people, but he was actually, despite some claims to the contrary, over time a real person who did exist and actually did almost everything he wrote about in his book with a few embellishments. It's a kind of compendium of his travels throughout Asia and the Middle East from 1271 to 1294. It was a 24-year odyssey that he started when he was 17 and came back to Venice, where he was from, when he was 41 years old. To the best of our knowledge, that's what Marco Polo looked like. There's no portrait of him from life, but this was an early engraving from description, so he might very well have looked like this. In his day, when he was leaving from Venice, people thought the world looked like this. They were cosmologists who had a much different worldview, but they were in the academy, and that was a very rarefied stratum, and they just talked to one another. But the person in the street had a view of the world which was derived from a literal interpretation of the Bible. This is a more accurate idea of the actual Asian continent that they crossed to get to the court of the emperor Kublai Khan, who was the Mongol grandson of Genghis Khan, who had conquered China, and who was then the most powerful ruler in the world. More powerful than any ruler in Europe, more powerful than the Pope. Early in the journey, Marco had to cross a transitional area known as the Pamir Highlands, and this is somewhat east of Afghanistan. He talked about the atmosphere here being so thin that birds couldn't fly and that you couldn't build a fire. It was very still, very quiet, and very cold because the altitude was so high. He was passing through what we now call the roof of the world. It's near the Himalayas, near Mount Everest. Once they finished crossing this intense cold, they descended to the desert of Taklamakan, and this was again another transitional area, and they traveled on camels. And Marco talks about the caravans and how logically they were organized. The goal of all this traveling, one of the goals was to get to what was the early Mongol capital city. This is a picture I took during my visit there of Karakorum. Anyway, Karakorum, or Harhorum, was the ancient Mongol capital, and it was Kublai Khan who decided to move it to what's now Beijing, both to stake his claim to China and to try and merge the two cultures. When he finally got to Beijing, which took about 6 or 7 years, he was just beginning his adventures, and he had finally met Kublai Khan, got some sense of the grandeur of him. Kublai Khan selected him as his to be an intelligence agent and tax collector. As Marco walked along, he was basically confronted with empty spaces and with Mongol encampments. As nomads, they really didn't have cities. In fact, they were famous for destroying cities. Kublai Khan was engaged in this experiment in social engineering to try and change the Mongol habit of being a nomad, being nomadic, and to a more pastoral one, like the Chinese, of staying in one place and cultivating land and building cities. It really didn't work, but it was a very interesting experiment. Here's a representation of Kublai Khan. First Yuan emperor, which is what he called his dynasty. Yuan meant origin dynasty. In other words, he wanted to somehow give a sense that history was starting over again with the Mongol conquest of China. Now, here was the kind of thing that Marco was doing during his journey there, which was, you can see, commercial transactions. You'll notice they're using coins, but actually in China, they used an invention which was unheard of in Europe, paper money. Anyway, when Marco got back to Venice many years later, he brought back paper money and said, look at this wonderful invention. And people said to him, what are you talking about? What do you do with this? It's not going to work. Everybody knows you need to use coins or gems for, you know, for commerce. And also, it was here that Marco was began to become affected by the Buddhas, the statues of the Buddhas, as well as the monasteries and the actual Buddhist monks who were around the city. Marco Polo has now been adopted by China as an important national figure, and they've begun putting up these huge statues of him, except for Marco Polo, because they feel that he wrote very favorably about China, was a good ambassador, if you will. This is just sort of an overview of his route. Now, it's funny, you'll often see in books, manuscripts, online, wherever, Marco Polo's route to China. But there's something I have to tell you that I found after a lot of research. Nobody really knows, because it's a conjectural account. Marco didn't write a chronology as you look into his account. He wrote kind of a thematic description of his impressions of one place and then another and then another. It's more like a guidebook than a chronology. On his deathbed in 1324, that's what he said. So as much as there was in his book, we can only imagine the adventures and exploits and people that he left out. Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you.